In this lesson, you will learn how to find slope from a table. So in order to find slope from a table, recall in our previous lessons with slope that that is the ratio of the vertical change to the horizontal change. And then we also talked about some other ways that you can refer to slope, as in the change in y compared to the change in x. And then in a graph, we calculated the rise compared to the run. So we can see that this vertical change is synonymous with that change in y. So think about your y-axis being your vertical axis. And also that referring to how much you would rise up or down, and your horizontal change is your change in x, so your x-axis is your horizontal axis, or how much you would run from left to right. So when we're referring to a table of values, then we're talking about that change between our x values and our y values. So looking at our x values here of 1 and 4, we can see that from our initial x value of 1 going up to 4, that our change between those two values would be going up by 3. So 1 plus 3 would give us this 4 here. And so we are also looking to see what happens to our y at that same place. So here we have 8, and then what happens to that 8? So we end up at 6. And so that relationship would be that we are subtracting 2. So 8 minus 2 would be 6. So going back up to our x value, so we're looking at 4, and the 4 will become that 7. So we would add 3 to the 4, so that would be 7. And the same thing here, we would look at the 6, the relationship between 6 and 4, and we would be subtracting 2. To get on the x values from 7 to 10, that relationship, we would add 3 to 7 in order to get 10. And that relationship on our y values from 4 to 2 would be that we're subtracting 2. So if we think about our relationship between our x and our y values as our change in y, so what happens with our y values? Well, our change in y would be that we are subtracting 2 compared to adding 3. So we can write our change in y as being negative 2 compared to that positive 3, which would be the same as just negative 2/3. So we can leave that as our slope, or that comparison from a table. So if we were to graph the points that we can graph, so looking at the point 1, 8 and the point 4, 6, the point 7, 4 and the point 10, 2. And we've talked about how to find slope from a graph. So starting with our point on the left and going down 2 and over 3, down 2 and over 3, down 2 and over 3. So we can see that the slope that we would get if we had a graph of negative 2/3 is the same that we can also tell from a table by calculating the change in y compared to the change in x. So these two slopes would be the same, and it really doesn't matter how you would write that slope between those two slopes here, as negative 2/3 or negative 2/3 would be the same. So let's look at another example. So if we have this table of values, we're looking at the relationship between our x values here from 6 to 2, so we'd be subtracting 4, and to get from 8 to 5, we would be subtracting 3. To get from 2 to negative 2, we would also subtract 4, so 2 minus 4 would be negative 2. 5, to get to 2, we would subtract 3. And then lastly, to get from negative 2 to negative 6, that relationship would also be to subtract 4. And to get from 2 to negative 1, we would be subtracting 3. So remember that we want our change in y as our numerator, so we would have negative 3 over our change in x, which is negative 4. One thing to notice here, that if you have a negative divided by a negative, so that's the same as just a fraction bar, that we would simplify that to be a positive 3/4. If we were to plot these points on a coordinate plane and plot the point 6, 8, the point 2, 5, the point negative 2, 2, and the point negative 6, negative 1, We could see starting with our point on the left, we would go up 3 and over 4, up 3 and over 4, up 3 and over 4. And so we would have that slope as a positive 3/4. So make sure that if you have a change in y that is negative and a change in x that is also negative, that you look and see that that graph would actually be a positive slope. The graph would have a positive slope there, so we need to simplify that to be a positive 3/4. So in this lesson, you've learned how to find slope from a table by finding the change in y compared to the change in x.